The terrifying video you see now shows Romanian orphans living under the communist regime of Ceaușescu in the 80s. They were kept in cages, often without clothes, food, or medical care. Many of them died from starvation or illness that could have been easily treated. There were hundreds of thousands of children in such conditions during that time, and actually most of them weren't even orphans. It's just their parents didn't have money to afford them. How's that even possible? Well, in October 1966, Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceaușescu introduced Decree 770. This decree not only banned abortion, but also contraception methods. His aim was to significantly boost Romania's population. See, Ceaușescu believed that a larger population would lead to economic growth, so he created policies to make women have more babies. The government used lots of propaganda, portraying mothers as heroes and stigmatizing women who chose not to have children. They even made taxes on those without kids, which added an extra 10% to their income tax. People had no option but to have unprotected sex, so the birth rate skyrocketed. But the other problem was that people were incredibly impoverished at that period. As a result, they didn't have money to provide for the basic needs of these newborns. The Ceaușescu regime promised to support these families, but didn't really provide genuine assistance. So parents started giving up their children to orphanages, which weren't prepared for that. And that's where the disaster began. Tens of thousands of children were quickly placed into these orphanages. As the number of children grew, the living conditions worsened rapidly. Orphanages had a severe shortage of caregivers. Because of this, children in these institutions were often identified by their caregivers' names rather than their real ones. Over time, they even forgot their true names. The orphanages had many untrained staff, including nurses and doctors. Because of this, many kids got their own diagnosis and treatments. Many of these children were misdiagnosed with mental health issues, when in reality they were perfectly normal. They were put in psychiatric hospitals and given strong medicines that messed up their developing brains, causing real mental problems. Not only that, some orphans with not so serious issues like cataracts or slight anemia didn't get proper treatment. This led to things like blindness or even death. Many children were infected with HIV and AIDS because of unclean medical tools. After the Ceaușescu regime fell, American reports from Romania showed horrifying pictures of extremely thin, starving kids. I'm not sure if I can show this footage without getting 18+ on this video. This looked like something from a Nazi concentration camp, but that was just Romanian orphanages 30 years ago. It's estimated that approximately 15 to 20,000 children died in these orphanages over 2 decades. Romania's child mortality rate increased by 170% during that period. It was 10 times higher than in neighboring countries. These kids often faced physical violence for their inability to do simple tasks like counting to 5 or saying the alphabet. Tragically, they also fell victim to sexual abuse. The older children, seeing the attitude of their caregivers, began to take an example from them and bully the younger ones. Former orphanage staff members have said it all was pretty common in those times. Also, children often were naked because the caregivers couldn't put the clothes on them. They commonly were left in their own feces and urine, tied to their beds or restrained in their own clothing because the caregivers wrongly thought they had mental problems. Just imagine how mentally damaged all these kids became after that. Many had delayed cognitive development. Actually, the case of Romanian orphanages was heavily researched. Scientists now know much more about parental bonding and the brain because of that. According to the English-Romanian adoptee study, the longer children spent in Romanian orphanages, the worse their IQ was in adolescence. For example, kids adopted before 6 months old had an IQ of 102 when they turned 11, but kids between 6 months and 2 years had much lower IQs, only 86 when they turned 11, and for children adopted later, it was even lower. MRI studies showed that Romanian kids who grew up in Romanian orphanages had smaller brains than kids who grew up normally. Because there were so many children in there, they lacked emotional attachment, which created difficulties for them in the future. They found it hard to trust others, often felt alone, and had troubles connecting with their new parents. It was also studied. So the Romanian experiment has improved the world's orphanage system, which is one of the few positive things in this story. If you looked at a Romanian orphanage in, say, the 80s, you would think that's a prison. Kids lived in cages and were treated inhumanely. Ceaușescu was a a man who didn't care about people. He used them as tools for his crazy ideas and experiments. His policies also led to around 9,000 women losing their lives because of complications from illegal abortions. These kids eventually were the ones who took a part in taking down the Ceaușescu regime, but the problems didn't end there. Even decades later, the orphanages were far from ideal, and many former orphans found themselves homeless. In 2001, approximately 20,000 children were living on the streets. They often sought shelter in the metro, started smoking at a young age, and worked just to avoid starving. While the situation has improved over time, these memories will forever be a haunting part of Romanian history.